Oh, well, hello there again. Welcome back to another session of Spanish 202 Remote. Um, in this video presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about one of the major assignments that's coming up. Originally, when I thought that this remote period was going to be 2 weeks, I intended that we would do this assignment in class once we're back together on campus. That's not going to happen, obviously, at this point. So we're going to have to conduct the second oral interview remotely. So I want to talk a little bit in this presentation about how we're going to go about doing that, the sorts of things that you ought to be practicing. We're going to look at the rubric together. If you have any questions along the way, please feel free to send me a message. If you'd like to chat face-to-face, we can do that in a variety of ways. If you have Zoom, that's what I've been using to make these presentations. If you prefer Blackboard Collaborate, Skype, whatever, it doesn't matter. We can find a way to chat. So just let me know. So the first thing I'm going to do is share my screen with you. And then talk a little bit about how this is going to work. Okay, so if you go to the syllabus on the Blackboard site, you will see that our second oral interview is coming up on the week of April the 7th and the 9th. So that's roughly when we're going to conduct it. That's the first thing to keep in mind. Next thing to keep in mind, if you're on Blackboard, if you scroll down to the folder called Oral Interview 2, you'll see two documents. The first document, the guidelines for the oral interview. The second document is the rubric for the oral interview. I want to talk a little bit about both of those today. So first, the guidelines. Be sure to take a close look at the guidelines. They give you not only, as you can see, the readings that will be included in the oral interview, but also a list, though not exhaustive, of possible questions. Okay? So be sure that as you're doing the readings, you're thinking about these questions, you're imagining ways to answer them. That's what I want to talk about today. If you go to the oral interview rubric, you will see that the rubric is divided into the four categories. The first category has to do with your answers to the questions, that is to say, whether they're detailed, clear, coherent, and so on. The third category has to do with your level of preparation, whether you answer without halts and pauses, using appropriate connector vocabulary, and so on. And the fourth category has to do with your language, the grammatical structures that you use. The second category is critically important. Note that it's called use of the subjunctive. In this category, you're required to make consistent, appropriate, and accurate use of subjunctive constructions throughout the interview. So what I want to talk a little bit about today in this presentation is how you can, as you're preparing for the interview, begin to think about how to use the subjunctive to answer your questions. In some cases, we'll see it's fairly obvious. In other cases, it's less obvious. Okay? So I want to take as an example a few of the questions that appear on the set of possible questions for the interview. So let's take this one first. The question is this: ¿Por qué es importante la tierra para los indígenas? Now, this is just a relatively straightforward, open-ended question. And you might wonder, well, how can I use the subjunctive in this question? How can I use the subjunctive? Here's the thing to keep in mind. You can use the subjunctive with any sentence as long as you frame it correctly. So let's take an example. Suppose we're talking about this question. Suppose I ask you this question. ¿Por qué es importante la tierra para los indígenas? You could answer this question using the subjunctive, or you could answer using the indicative. Let's start with the indicative. You could simply begin by saying, la tierra es importante para los indígenas, porque es una fuente de alimentación. There you go. Any subjunctive in that sentence? No, not at all. Just a straightforward indicative answer. Now, if you wanted to incorporate the subjunctive into the sentence, you can do so using any of the subjunctive triggers that we've talked about in the course so far. So for instance, you could, rather than say this, la tierra es importante para los indígenas, you could begin by using a subjunctive trigger word. For instance, like, me sorprende. It surprises me. Okay, la tierra. And now, what do we need? Now we need the subjunctive. So now, Me sorprende que la tierra sea importante para los indígenas. Yeah, very good. So now we've incorporated the subjunctive, just as a kind of lead-in to our answer. So, me sorprende que la tierra sea importante. Es importante porque es una fuente de alimentación. So here we've introduced another sentence, included another sentence that requires subjunctive as a kind of lead-in to our answer. Yeah? That's one way of using the subjunctive. Here's another example with question number 2. It says, ¿cuáles son los problemas que enfrentan los indígenas? Now, if you wanted, you could begin this answer with a straightforward indicative response. So, for instance, los problemas que enfrentan los indígenas son, and then you list the problems. That would be a straightforwardly indicative response, no subjunctive. What's a way of beginning this answer using the subjunctive? How could you frame your response using the subjunctive? No? Here's a possibility. We could use an impersonal expression. For example, es triste. It's sad. Es triste is an impersonal expression, expresses an emotion, requires a subjunctive. Es triste que los indígenas, and now subjunctive, tengan tantos problemas. ¿Sí? Or, es triste que los indígenas enfrenten, subjunctive, ¿sí? Enfrenten tantos problemas. Yeah? Does that make sense? So that's a way of incorporating the subjunctive into a question that doesn't obviously demand the subjunctive. Here's another kind of question. Now, in this case, it's a little bit more obvious how you might use the subjunctive. See? So it says, ¿qué quieren los indígenas que se haga para resolver estos problemas? What do the indigenous want to be done to resolve these problems? Well, here, it's easy to use a subjunctive. You could say, for instance, los indígenas quieren que, and then obviously we use the subjunctive. Quieren que los gobiernos defiendan sus derechos. ¿Sí? We could also say, es triste que los gobiernos no defiendan los derechos de los indígenas. There's another way. And similarly, for the final question we have listed here, ¿es importante que defendamos los derechos de los indígenas? Here it's relatively straightforward how you might answer using the subjunctive, partially because the subjunctive is already in the question. So, for instance, we could say, sí, es muy importante que defendamos. ¿Sí? Es muy importante que defendamos los derechos de los indígenas. ¿No? We could say, me enoja, it angers me. Okay? Los gobiernos no defiendan. Another way of using the subjunctive, using a subjunctive indicator in the main clause to trigger the subjunctive in the second part of the clause. Okay? So, this is an important thing to keep in mind. Not every question in the list of possible questions obviously requires a subjunctive. So what you need to be thinking about is how you can creatively structure your answer so that it includes the subjunctive. And the easiest way to do that is by using those sort of subjunctive trigger clauses. Es importante, me sorprende, me enoja, me alegro, siento, lamento, all the ones that we've been talking about at this point in the course. Okay? So I hope that makes a little sense. Give it a shot, practice it a little bit. If you would like to send me an email about how you can incorporate the subjunctive more thoroughly into your answers for this portion of the course, that is to say for the second oral interview, please feel free to let me know that as well, and I'll be happy to give you any guidance I can. Very well. Okay, well that'll be all for the moment, and I look forward to hearing from you soon.